The federal government is considering sanctions against China. Now, these sanctions allegedly have nothing to do with the trade war that we're currently engaged in with China. In fact, US lawmakers are arguing that we need to sanction China over its treatment of Muslims in the country. In fact, they have been detaining Muslims, Uyghur Muslims specifically, and making them change their ideology, rid themselves of their Muslim religion. And these are essentially camps, detainment camps that they're putting these individuals into. So Chinese Muslims in the camps are forced to attend daily classes, denounce aspects of Islam, study mainstream Chinese culture, and pledge loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. Some detainees who have been released have described torture by security officers. Now, this has been a story that's been going on over the last year. More and more reporters are becoming aware of what's happening in China with this Muslim minority in the country. In fact, PBS NewsHour did a story on it, and they give more detail into what's going on. So take a look.
Radio Free Asia journalist Gulchera Hoja told Congress last month her family is in camps where Uyghurs are reportedly subject to torture and indoctrination.
And I learned in February that my aunts, cousins, their children, more than 20 people had been swept up by authorities in the same day.
That hearing was called by Senator Marco Rubio. Yesterday, he and 16 other Senate and House members sent the State and Treasury Departments a letter accusing China of arbitrary detention, torture, and egregious restrictions on religious practice and culture, and calling for sanctions on senior Chinese officials. Today, China's foreign ministry spokeswoman said Chinese minorities have freedom of religion, and the US had no right to criticize.
China's ethnic minority policies and the rights and equality ethnic minorities enjoy are even stronger than in the United States.
China says it's responding to what it calls Uyghur terrorism and a Uyghur separatist movement. In Xinjiang, many Uyghurs seek an independent homeland and clash with police. China says it's trying to maintain stability and does not detain anyone arbitrarily.
So what's fascinating about this story is who we're hearing from in terms of US politicians. Marco Rubio is one of the politicians who's actually speaking out against this. He says the scale of it, it's massive. It involves not only intimidating people on political speech, but also a desire to strip people of their identity, ethnic identity, religious identity, on a scale I'm not sure we've seen in the modern era. So while some US politicians are speaking out against this and calling for sanctions, Trump has been resistant to it, and it appears that he's softening on the idea of implementing some of these sanctions. And this is my thoughts on it, but my suspicion is that Trump is salty toward China because of the trade war that we're involved in. I don't think that these two things are separate. When it comes to Trump's decision making, Trump keeps ramping up the tariffs on China. China retaliates in a similar fashion. It just keeps getting worse. And I think that's one of the reasons why Trump has softened his ideas on implementing some sanctions.
So mixed news here for Republicans. I'm about to give some of them credit in a second, but notice what the Chinese are doing in these camps. And by the way, the scope of the camps is unreal. Hundreds of thousands, maybe up to 1 million people in what could be considered, internment camps, detention camps. I don't want to use the other word, but apparently there's torture there. Now, they're forced into patriotism, pledging loyalty to their country, forced integration into the culture. You must assimilate into Chinese culture, and you must denounce Islam. Who does that sound like? You turn on Fox News any day of the week and they'll tell you, why won't these ethnic minorities assimilate into American culture? Why won't they do it? We should make them do it, otherwise they should get kicked out of the country.
No, but that's the reason why this story was shocking to me, that our current government is considering sanctioning China over their treatment of Muslims. Look, we're not imprisoning Muslims here, but we are certainly contributing to what's happening in Yemen right now. All those civilians getting murdered in Yemen right now. We have teamed up with Saudi Arabia, and look, there was a point made in that PBS NewsHour video by a Chinese official who said, said something about the US human rights abuses. We are guilty of human rights abuses. Maybe not in the United States, but certainly in other countries. I mean, if you want to talk about, our actions leading to the deaths of innocent individuals abroad.
And we're guilty of stuff here as well. I mean, look at how unarmed black men get treated in this country, and the list goes on. And we're separating families at the border now, and then they have their own detention camps,
right,
et cetera. That doesn't make what China's doing right. And by the way, it also doesn't mean that it's on the same scale. There's 11 million Uighurs in China. Now these reports say up to 1 million of them, 10% of them, are put into these detention camps with brainwashing, potentially torture, et cetera, et cetera. So, and you want to talk about denouncing Islam. Trump is famous for, during the campaign, saying we have to have a total ban on Muslims until we figure out what the hell is going on.
Right.
That is why you'll excuse us if we're a little skeptical that Trump is doing this because of his newfound respect for the Muslim religion. Right? That would be borderline shocking.
And by the way, take Muslims out of it for a second. And by the way, let me just correct myself, because you're right. We are guilty of human rights abuses here as well. I mean, the zero tolerance policy was the latest example of that. But Trump has an affinity for dictators throughout the world who carry out human rights abuses. I mean, he bragged about how Kim Jong-un, how the people of North Korea, salute Kim Jong-un because they're forced to. Right? Yeah. I mean, he loves that kind of stuff. So that's why I think when it comes to Trump, there's an ulterior motive. I don't think it's really about human rights abuses.
So, by the way, another pronunciation of Uyghur is Uighur, like my last name. It is the same thing. Now, I am not an ethnic Uighur, but our family was named after them. I've told that story before in a post game. I can tell it to you again today in another post game. That's for the members. tyt.com/join. Become a member. That way we get to have more time to discuss these things. But it's not about me. So this story about however you pronounce it, the Uighurs. Now let me turn around and give Republicans credit. Now look, if you tell me Trump actually cares about human rights abuses, wants to go after dictators and protect Muslims, you're not ever going to get me to believe that. Okay, so but the Trump administration so far is doing this. Even if they're doing for a bad purpose where they want to punish China about trade and not really about human rights abuses, I'll take it. Even if Trump didn't want to do it, but he was forced into do it by the rest of his administration, but they actually carry this out and fight for human rights causes, I'll take it. And I'll give Trump credit. If he actually does this and fights for those people, I don't care why he did it. I don't care who forced him to do it. At the end of the day, he's the president and I will give him credit. And obviously there are people inside the administration that want to do this and it's the right thing to do. Give them credit. And of all people, Marco Rubio, who I cannot stand, who I think is a fake politician and all that stuff, he is fighting for this, that's clear.
Yep.
And I really don't care about his motivations in this regard. So he's fighting for 1 million people that are sitting in detention camps right now, while the Chinese government tries to destroy their ethnicity and their identity, okay? And the fact that Rubio is fighting for them, he deserves a lot of credit, and so did the senators that all signed on to that letter, Democrat and Republican. So, man, look, if Republicans do the right thing, why wouldn't we give them credit? Bless their hearts, that's fantastic, that's what we want. Just doesn't happen that often, but in this case it is. So Rubio does deserve the credit and people inside the Trump administration do as well. Now finally, there's the propaganda, whether it's from the Chinese government, and by the way, they do, let me say this as I do with every country. The Chinese government does not represent all the Chinese people. And so just because they have a right-wing government in there, they can call themselves communists, but they are uber capitalists, right, all obsessed with their own wealth, right? And run basically a dictatorial government. And so they do not represent all the Chinese people in China or across the world. As I tell you all the time, the Israeli right-wing government does not represent all the people in Israel. And the American government under Trump, Bush, et cetera, did not represent us. Under Cheney, did not represent us. They represent, yes, a section of the people. In China, it's even a smaller section. Well, here in America, our politicians represent our donors. In China, they represent the Politburo, okay, basically. So, but look at what's happening in the world. As the Chinese government says the Muslims are bad and they're separatists, et cetera, and we have to go and crush the Muslims. Fox News tells you every day, and Donald Trump tells you, the Muslims are the problem. We got to go get the Muslims. The Muslims are the problem. Meanwhile, it's the Muslims that are in detention camps by the hundreds of thousands, perhaps a million in China. It's the Muslims who were displaced in Myanmar, mass murders, rapes. 700,000 people live in squalid conditions right now in Bangladesh because they were driven out by massacres in Myanmar. But yet, the talking points never change. Muslims are the bad guys. It's in their nature, it's in their religion. And a lot of people make the argument, no. Islam is worse than all the other religions. It is irredeemable. Now, when other religions do it or non-religions do it, no, that was just a one-off. That was just coincidence. When Muslims get crushed, whether it's in Myanmar, China, or by the way, Yemen from other Muslims, Iraq, Syria from other Muslims, aided and abetted by the United States of America, the Russians in the case of Syria, etc. No, look away. No, Muslims are always the guilty one, not the victims. The reality is, no, the world is not black and white. Chinese people are not all bad. They don't all hate Muslims. That's insane. All Muslims are not bad. They're not just victims and they're not just the aggressors. It depends. Do they have power? Do they not have power? What is the politics of the situation? What's the economic situation? So please, what we're asking you to do is to take a look at the world as it is. And yes, it is complex and it has many different factors. Don't go to, honestly, the same way of thinking as this Chinese government saying, Muslims bad, put them into camps, make them non-Muslims, right? Yeah. And unfortunately, some of our right wing think along similar lines. But for those that don't, they deserve credit.
Yeah, and by the way, I just really want to emphasize that they're not just putting adults in these camps, they're putting children in these camps as well. Doesn't matter what their age is. If they're categorized as Uyghur Muslims, they're being forced into these camps, and in some cases tortured.
The TYT Plus app is now available on iOS and Android. Download to get more TYT content at tyt.com/app.